You ever spent $500,000 on a house, only to wake up one day and find yourself locked out of your own backyard? No notice, no explanation, just a new lock installed by the HOA. That was the day I realized this wasn't a neighborhood. It was a battlefield. And the woman in charge, she didn't just enforce the rules, she weaponized them. My name's Jonathan Hale, and this is the story of how I dismantled an entire HOA using nothing but their own bylaws. Subscribe to the HOA Karen files, because when Karen comes for your yard, you better come for her whole damn kingdom. They locked me out of my own backyard. Not a phone call, not a notice. No courtesy knock on the door. Just a brand new industrial lock welded onto the latch of the rear gate that leads from my property into the public greenbelt behind my house. That gate was on my land. I stood there in silence that morning, still sweating from my usual 5-mile run, staring at a hunk of brass that had no business being there. My breathing slowed, my fists clenched, but my face remained calm. See, when most people get pushed, they push back. Me, I prepare. My name is Jonathan Hale. I've spent 11 years in digital forensics with the U.S. Department of Justice, dissecting the behavior of people who abuse systems to control others. Cyber criminals, corporate thieves, politicians with too much ambition and too little conscience. When I retired early and moved to Ridgegate Hills, I thought I was stepping into peace and silence. I was wrong. This neighborhood looked perfect. Manicured lawns, earth-toned houses, wrought iron fences, jogging paths. Everything had that artificial stillness people pay for when they're tired of chaos. I thought it was the calm I needed after a brutal divorce and a burned-out career. But Ridgegate Hills had its own kind of predators. They didn't hide in basements or behind keyboards. They sat on committees, HOA boards, wearing golf polos and fake smiles, and the queen bee of them all was Karen Delaney. Karen wasn't just the president of the HOA, she was the HOA. Blonde highlights, neatly pressed blazer, a clipboard that might as well have been a weapon, and a voice that oozed manufactured authority. I'd seen her around a few times before that gate incident. She never waved. She didn't smile like the others. But she noticed everything. Who parked on the street, whose lawn was slightly too long, whose garbage cans didn't get pulled in by 6 p.m. She was the kind of person who enforced rules not to protect property value, but to exercise control. So when my gate was suddenly sealed without warning, I knew exactly where to look first. I called the HOA office. The receptionist transferred me 3 times before putting me through to Karen herself. "Mr. Hale," she said, with a tone as flat as legal paper. "The board voted to secure all secondary access points to the Greenbelt. There have been multiple safety complaints." From whom, I asked? "That information is confidential. I never received a vote notice. It was an emergency measure. Under which section of the HOA charter do you have authority to modify a homeowner's private structure without consent?" She didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, she sighed. "Mr. Hale, Ridgegate Hills operates on a sense of trust and shared community values. We hope residents understand that these measures are taken for everyone's safety." Trust. That word hit different. It's what criminals ask for right before they steal from you. That night, I went digging, pulled out my home purchase binder, the original survey maps, the recorded deed, Section 12C, page 6. The boundary line extended 3 feet beyond the back fence, meaning the gate, the soil around it, and even the portion of sidewalk behind it were all on my property. Legally, which meant the HOA had no jurisdiction. I took pictures, marked everything, compiled dates. Logged the call with Karen. I wasn't looking for justice, I was building a case. That's the difference between outrage and strategy. The next morning, I paid a visit to the HOA office in person. The lobby looked like any other over-sanitized, overly beige suburban power center. Framed certificates, slogans about community excellence. A bulletin board full of events nobody wanted to attend. Karen met me in the conference room with her sidekick, Frank Wilson, the HOA vice president. Frank was the kind of man who lived to nod in meetings and sweat through polyester shirts. I laid the documents in front of them. This is the survey. This is my deed. This gate is on my property. You had no legal right to modify it. You've trespassed and potentially committed criminal mischief. Karen didn't blink. Frank blinked enough for both of them. She reached for the papers, casually flipping through as if it were a restaurant menu. Mr. Hale, she said, our legal team interprets property boundaries in a broader community context, and I should remind you, refusal to comply with board mandates can result in escalating penalties. I leaned in, quietly. I used to work with federal prosecutors. The last person who tried the broad interpretation defense went to prison for 6 years. But by all means, let's test your theory in court. The tension was silent but thick. I walked out, not angry, not rattled, satisfied. They'd made their move. Now it was my turn. I started digging. 3 years of meeting minutes, vendor contracts, HOA financial summaries, all public under the Homeowners Transparency Act in this state. And the deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. Property violations spiked every fall. So did special assessments. Multiple residents cited for vague things like landscape disharmony or mailbox inconsistency. Some sold their homes within 90 days of repeated citations. Almost all were bought by a company called Horizon West Investments. I cross-checked that with state records. Guess who's listed as an executive? Thomas Delaney, Karen's ex-husband. That's when the pattern became a blueprint. Push residents out with endless fines, devalue the property, acquire through shell companies, flip for profit. It was a racket. A legal laundering scheme hiding behind clipboards and concerned neighbor forms, but it was also sloppy. Frank had signed off on multiple contracts with vendors who shared mailing addresses with relatives. Karen had approved surveillance camera installations without a vote that cost over $28,000 with no breakdown of labor or hardware. That's when I activated phase 2, surveillance. I installed 6 motion detecting cameras around my house, some visible, most hidden, one disguised in a solar path light, another inside a decorative owl, the most important one on the gate. I set them to ping encrypted backups every 15 minutes. I wasn't just collecting footage, I was preserving it in court-admissible formats. Because predators like Karen, they always return to the scene. And when they do, I'll be ready. The first thing the camera caught was a shadow, 114A, the night after I confronted Karen in the HOA office, my backyard, just beyond the gate. A figure moved behind the trees near the edge of the greenbelt, slow, cautious, and exactly what I expected. It wasn't a trespasser. It was Frank Wilson, the man who couldn't hold eye contact during our meeting, the man who flinched every time Karen spoke. And now, he was holding a flashlight and a set of tools in a branded Ridgegate Hills maintenance bag. The footage showed him kneeling by the gate, fiddling with the lock, the one they had installed. He wasn't checking it. He was inspecting something. Then his radio crackled. A second figure appeared. Karen, blazer over yoga pants. Clipboard in hand, like she couldn't function without it. She said something. The audio picked up one line clearly. Make sure there's no sign of tampering. It needs to look weathered. Weathered. They weren't inspecting. They were covering their tracks. By 1:33 a.m., they were gone, but not before Frank wiped his hands on a towel and dropped it behind a bush carelessly. I collected it the next morning. Latex residue. Smelled like acid wash likely used to corrode the gate's original components. Chemical vandalism, potentially hazardous. That towel went into a plastic evidence bag and into my fireproof safe. Strike one, but I wasn't ready to go public. Not yet. I needed more than a smoking gun. I needed to prove a pattern not just against me, but against the neighborhood. Systemic abuse of authority. And for that, I needed voices, witnesses. So I started talking, casually, at mailboxes, during walks. Outside the local grocery store, I played the part of a concerned new homeowner who just wanted to understand how the HOA works, and stories came flooding in. A couple down the street fined $150 for a wind chime. A veteran who was forced to remove his American flag because it clashed with the colonial aesthetic. A family cited 4 times in a month because their children left a tricycle on the front lawn. The most telling story came from Mr. Emerson, a retired accountant in his 70s. He showed me a folder, old school manila, labeled HOA abuse. Inside were over 20 printed citations, each more absurd than the last. One claimed his roof was too matte. Another fined him $200 for curtains visible from the exterior that do not comply with the neutral palette. Then he said something that stuck. They don't find people they like, only the ones who don't smile at Karen. That wasn't enforcement. That was retaliation. I took notes, dates, amounts, photos when possible. Then I cross-referenced their fines with property transfer records. 5 of the homes that had been cited the most had been sold within the past 2 years. 3 were now owned by shell companies. All had ties to Horizon West Investments. The more I mapped it out, the clearer it became. Karen's HOA wasn't about safety. It wasn't about order. It was a system of pressure and purge. A funnel. Create violations, apply stress, make people miserable, then sweep in with offers when they're ready to walk away. It was organized and it was profitable, but greed makes people sloppy, and I was counting on that. Over the next week, I filed 5 harmless HOA requests, all procedural, all perfect. Request number 1, replace porch light bulb, attached manufacturer spec sheet, lumen rating, photometric analysis. Request number 2, trim hedges, attached species confirmation, approved length range, pruning schedule. Request number 3, paint mailbox, attached swatch samples, finish comparison, reflection safety data. Each submission was 100% compliant. Each demanded time, review, signature. I didn't do it to be petty. I did it to log response times, track internal routing, and analyze the process from the inside. And it worked. Within 4 days, I received 2 contradictory notices, one approving the porch light change, another warning me that the exact same fixture may violate neighborhood harmony standards. They were making it up as they went. Strike 2. Then came the curtain notice. $175 fine for unauthorized curtain pattern in view from the street. The curtains hadn't changed in 3 months. I had footage proving it, but I paid it. Why? Because I wanted a receipt, a trail. That night, as I reviewed footage on my laptop, a second alert popped up from my network security software. An unknown device had connected briefly to my Wi-Fi from the curb outside. A phone. I traced the MAC address and flagged it. The next day, Karen walked past my house during her community walk. Same phone in hand, same pattern of stops and glances. They were scanning homes, possibly piggybacking unsecured signals. Illegal, not unless proven. Unethical, absolutely. And then, just as I expected, someone tampered with my power, briefly. The gate camera flickered off at 2:03 but my system had redundancies. Solar battery, local backup. I caught Frank again, this time cutting a thin wire under the gate box. Karen stood nearby, scanning with a flashlight. She whispered, "If he wants war, we'll give him paper cuts until he bleeds." Strike 3. They had officially crossed into criminal territory. Trespass, property damage, potential hacking. And now, it was my move. In 48 hours, I would deliver evidence to the State Attorney General's office, to the county sheriff, and more importantly, to the residents of Ridgegate Hills. Because the only thing HOA tyrants fear more than lawsuits is sunlight. By this point, I knew everything I needed to know about Karen Delaney. She wasn't a leader. She was a warden. And Ridgegate Hills wasn't a neighborhood. It was her private detention camp. But the thing about tyrants like her, they think fear is forever, that no one will push back because no one has. But history and law have something in common. They both turn slowly, until suddenly, they don't. So I started building my wall. Not a real wall, a legal one, a bureaucratic one, a fortress made of paper, codes and clauses. And I was going to bury the HOA under it. It started with one email, pursuant to HOA Bylaws, Section 5. 2 CE, I am formally requesting all financial statements, meeting minutes, vendor contracts, and budget approvals for the previous 36 months. I copied every board member. I cited the Homeowners' Right to Transparency Act, which required compliance within 10 business days. I printed that statute on the footer of the email in bold. Karen didn't reply. Frank did. Dear Mr. Hale, your tone is aggressive. These types of requests are highly unusual and disruptive to the community. That was the response I wanted, because disruptive is not a legal defense. I printed that email too. Then I filed a second request. Please provide documentation validating the HOA's legal authority to alter physical fixtures located within private property lines. 3 days later, I received a generic PDF about community harmony. They had no idea how badly they were screwing up. Meanwhile, I kept compiling stories. Every neighbor I'd spoken to got a folder. Inside copies of their citations, timelines, scanned documents, and in several cases, videos, all backed up to a cloud drive, each one authenticated and indexed. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was a class action outline. Allison Wu was the first to join me officially. She lived across the street, corporate attorney turned stay-at-home mom. Her home had been cited for inappropriate lawn toys because her toddler left a plastic truck near the porch. She had receipts. She had rage. And she had time. We formed a committee, reform, on paper, revolution in practice. Allison drafted the first petition, a demand for a special board election under HOA Rule 4.1a. We needed 25% of homeowner signatures to trigger it. We gathered 41% in 4 days. But I wasn't done. While the neighborhood signed petitions, I kept pushing from another angle: malicious compliance. Every rule Karen had weaponized, I now used like a scalpel. I submitted 14 formal modification requests in a single week, every one of them flawlessly documented. A request to adjust my sprinkler head by 17 degrees, attached topographic analysis. A request to repaint a basement vent cover, attached paint chips, airflow study, historical HOA color precedent. A request to add 2 stepping stones, attached erosion impact estimate, satellite overlays, soil pH report. Each request forced a review. Each demanded a board vote. And under the rules, each required acknowledgement within 10 business days. By week's end, they were drowning. Frank emailed me again. Mr. Hale, your actions appear intentionally obstructive. The HOA reserves the right to levy special assessments against members who act in bad faith. I replied with one line, complying with your own rules is in bad faith. Mr. Wilson, it's just inconvenient for tyrants. They stopped responding, so I went public. Not with lawyers, not with lawsuits, with neighbors. We held a cookout, my backyard. Nothing official, just lawn chairs, iced tea, and laptops. 20 people showed up. 11 had been fined in the last 90 days. 5 were considering moving. I showed them the camera footage Karen and Frank tampering with the gate, the nighttime surveillance, the whisper about paper cuts, the towel with chemical residue. People gasped. Some cursed. Others just stared in silence, like they were finally seeing the monster that had been living among them for years. Then I showed them the real weapon, the documents, my wall, every fine, every abuse, every contract signed with a company linked to Karen's inner circle. We didn't need to break the HOA. We just had to follow the rules so precisely, so brutally, that the system turned against itself. That night, we finalized our plan. Public meeting next Thursday. Formal demand for board resignation. Legal notifications already filed with the county clerk. Anonymous tip to a local investigative journalist. And just in case Karen tried anything else, I'd already spoken with a state compliance officer off the record. All I needed now was one final misstep from her, one more arrogant overreach. She didn't disappoint. 3 days later, I received a certified letter, a $750 fine. My violation, hosting an unregistered event with more than 4 unrelated adults. They fined me for a cookout. That envelope was the last nail in their own coffin. And when I opened it, I smiled, because I wasn't the one under investigation anymore. They were Thursday night, Community Room C, Ridgegate Hills Recreation Center, the same room where Karen had reigned for 6 years, same stale coffee, same stacked metal chairs, same projector that hadn't worked properly since the Obama administration, but this time, it was full. Wall to wall, standing room only, at least 60 residents packed in, some curious, most quiet, all watching. Karen stood at the front, clipboard in hand, reading off the agenda with her usual precision, monotone, robotic, like it was just another HOA meeting, like she hadn't spent the last month violating the rights of half the people in the room. She didn't see the shift, not yet. Frank sat beside her, tapping his pen like a metronome for his anxiety. Behind them, a laptop played a slideshow of landscaping updates, stock photos they probably pulled from Google. At 7:43 p.m., she said, "If there is no new business, we'll adjourn promptly at 8. That was my cue. I raised my hand. She hesitated. For a moment, the room tightened. She nodded once. Mr. Hale, briefly. I stood as holding a single folder, calm, precise. I'd like to motion for a formal review of the current board's conduct, I said. Under Section 5.3 of the HOA Bylaws, any member in good standing may call for a vote of no confidence if supported by 25% of attending homeowners. Silence, then rustling. Hands went up. Not a few. Dozens. Karen froze. This isn't on the agenda, she said, but it is allowed. I replied, pointing to the projected bylaws behind her, the ones she had insisted be visible for transparency. Section 5. 3 was highlighted. Frank cleared his throat. This kind of motion needs to be submitted in writing. It was 4 days ago, time-stamped, certified, sent to the HOA inbox, signed by 41% of the community. I have copies. I held up the petition. She tried to pivot. This meeting is for scheduled agenda items only, and that's why I scheduled it, said Allison Wu, standing up behind me. She held up her own packet. I submitted a second motion for open discussion under Section 6.4. Also certified, also ignored. Karen's face went pale. The projector light flickered. Someone cut the slideshow. I stepped forward and connected my laptop to the HDMI cable. What came on screen wasn't a presentation. It was footage. Crystal clear, time-stamped, color-corrected, audio-enhanced. Karen and Frank. Midnight. My backyard. Chemical tools in hand. Whispering about damage control. Make it look like weatherware. Someone gasped. Then came the financial records. Side-by-side comparisons, HOA vendor payouts, Horizon West shell purchases, matching addresses, all cross-referenced, all sourced. This is fraud, someone muttered. I knew something was off. Another said. Karen tried to cut me off. This is slander. Actually, I said, pulling a folder from the podium. This is a notarized affidavit from Mr. Emerson, your former treasurer. He resigned after you refused to explain a $14 or $200 withdrawal labeled community enhancement. Turns out that money funded a security system for your private residence. Another document flashed on screen. We were under threat, Karen snapped. We needed surveillance. Then why did the vendor invoice go to your home address and list interior nanny cam install? She didn't answer. Frank stood up. We did what we thought was best for Ridgegate. Then Ridgegate should have the right to decide if it agrees. Allison said, we opened the floor. 10 residents spoke. 5 told their stories. 2 cried. One couple explained how they sold their home at a $90,000 loss after Karen cited them for a shade imbalance on their porch. Then I called for the vote. Hands went up. Everywhere. Out of the 63 attendees, 58 voted to remove the board. Only Karen, Frank, and 2 others voted no. It was done. On the record. By the book. By their own rules. Karen stood there, trembling not in fear, but rage, her control slipping, her legacy erased. I watched her lips part, searching for a threat to throw, a technicality to twist, but I beat her to it. I turned to the crowd and said all documents, footage, and evidence presented here tonight have been submitted to the State Attorney General's office and the County Ethics Committee. Karen said nothing. Frank sat down, and for the first time in 6 years, Ridgegate Hills was silent without her voice. We appointed an interim board, 3 volunteers, 1 retired judge. Allison as interim secretary. I declined a position because this wasn't about power for me. It was about precedent. When someone breaks into your home, you call the police, but when someone tries to steal your community, your peace, your freedom, you expose them in front of the people they pretended to protect. I packed up my laptop, folded the folder, and I walked out. The air felt different, lighter, like justice. I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen don't surrender, they scheme in silence. They wait for the spotlight to fade, then crawl out from underneath their losses and start looking for angles. And sure enough, 3 days later, I got the letter, certified, legal header, signature from a law firm I recognized, Holloway and Bench, HOA defense specialists, inside a cease and desist. They accused me of orchestrated disruption of HOA operations, unauthorized surveillance, and public defamation of elected officials. They wanted me to retract everything, or face civil litigation. I didn't even blink, because Karen had finally made her fatal mistake. She took the fight from community to court, and I'm much more comfortable in court. I contacted my attorney, Carla Denton, former DOJ prosecutor, now in private practice. I gave her everything: footage, documents, bylaws, timelines, the works. She reviewed it, smiled once, and said, "This isn't a lawsuit. This is a panic attack." We drafted a formal reply, 18 pages, including citations of 3 HOA abuse cases that had gone to federal court and lost. We demanded retraction of the letter, an apology, and a written acknowledgement that any future legal threats would be considered harassment and obstruction. We gave them 7 business days to comply. They replied on day 5. No apology, just silence. But Karen wasn't done. Later that week, several residents reported that anonymous complaints had been filed against them, all over petty issues. A hedge that was overgrown by 2 inches, a garden gnome that could be seen from the street, a front-facing camera that violated aesthetic integrity. It was her old playbook. Only now, she was operating from the shadows. We traced the source. Every complaint had been filed online using the old HOA web portal, which had since been disabled by the interim board. But someone had cloned it, set up a near-identical interface on a private server, and tricked residents into submitting updates. It was a phishing site, a digital honeypot, and Karen had been the first to submit a complaint. What she didn't know, I was still running passive packet capture on the community network. I had logs, IP addresses, timestamps. Even the MAC address of the device she used, a tablet registered to Frank Wilson, still pinging from his home. We published the data to the community Google Drive. No commentary, just facts. By Monday, 17 residents had filed affidavits about fraudulent citations. The interim board passed a unanimous resolution banning Karen and Frank from participating in any HOA communications or decisions indefinitely. But I wasn't finished. Because while she was playing petty with gnomes and shrubs, I was preparing my final report, a 78-page complaint to the State Housing Oversight Board. Inside 14 counts of financial irregularities, 9 cases of procedural abuse, 4 confirmed incidents of unauthorized property access, 2 separate incidents of digital interference, plus a signed statement from a former board member who admitted Karen instructed him to generate violation reports on homes where residents weren't aligned with HOA culture. It was submitted, time-stamped, copied to 3 agencies, and I waited. A week passed, then 2, then I got the call. The county sheriff's department wanted to schedule a formal interview. 3 officers had already been briefed on the case. One was former cybercrimes division. When we met, I didn't speak in hypotheticals. I gave them hard data, video files, network logs, call recordings. Every word I said was backed by a digital footprint. The officer reviewing the USB drive leaned back and said, "This is the most comprehensive case file I've ever seen on a neighborhood dispute." I smiled. It was never a neighborhood dispute. It was a small-scale abuse of power, and those scale just like any other crime. By the time I left that building, Karen's fate was no longer in Ridgegate's hands. It belonged to the state. The final blow came in the form of an email. Karen tried to file a lien against my property for unpaid compliance fees. It was rejected immediately. Why? Because the HOA's legal status had been temporarily suspended pending review. Her last bullet misfired. And now she had nothing left. It ended where it began. At the gate, the same spot where I stood months ago, locked out of my own property by a brass padlock and a woman drunk on power. But now the padlock was gone. The bolts were replaced, the gate repainted, and this time it swung open with a quiet click. Not resistance, no secrets, no surveillance, just freedom. Karen Delaney was gone, removed from the board, barred from any future community leadership. Facing pending criminal charges for property tampering, electronic fraud, and financial misappropriation, her mugshot had made the local news. A woman once feared by dozens of homeowners now reduced to a headline HOA president indicted in neighborhood power abuse scandal. Frank Wilson had taken a deal, gave up every email, every note, every password. He testified under oath in exchange for immunity and a quiet retirement somewhere out of state. The HOA was now under interim management, a new team, elected by the very people who used to whisper and apologize and pay fines just to be left alone. And Ridgegate Hills. It changed. The new board removed over $30,000 in unjust fines. They revised the bylaws, killed the aesthetic violation clause, dismantled the surveillance infrastructure Karen had put up without consent, and most importantly, they held open forums, real ones, where people could talk, where no one was fined for leaving a kid's toy on the lawn, where flags were flown again, military, pride, sports teams, because a neighborhood isn't a uniform, it's a mosaic. And me, I never asked for a seat on the board, never accepted a title. I wasn't looking for power. I was looking for peace. But I got something better. One Saturday afternoon, Allison stopped by with a bottle of wine. We sat on my back patio, overlooking the now quiet Greenbelt. Kids rode bikes in the distance. Someone barbecued. Sprinklers hissed across lawns no longer measured by rulers. Allison raised her glass. To the gate. I raised mine. To what it exposed. She asked me something that night, something that stayed with me. Why go through all this? You could have moved, could have ignored it. I looked out at the yard. The camera system was gone. The forensic drives were in storage. The wall of evidence had been taken down weeks ago, but in my head, the case was still open. Because people like Karen don't stop unless someone makes them. Because systems don't fix themselves. Because sometimes, justice needs to wear sweatpants and live in a cul-de-sac. We laughed, and for the first time in months, It wasn't the laugh of relief. It was joy, real, pure, earned. The next morning, I took down the last warning sign from my fence. The HOA violation notices, over 20 of them, had been shredded, turned into mulch. Used to fertilize the small fig tree growing by the side of my porch, a quiet middle finger wrapped in green leaves. And that gate still there, still swinging, still mine. I walk through it every evening now. No cameras, no tension, just the wind. And a quiet reminder that when people try to weaponize rules, sometimes the best revenge is knowing them better than they do. They lock me out, and I open the door to something bigger. That's one Karen down. But trust me, there are more. If you've been fined for your grass, your curtains, or your damn doormat, send me your story. We're not just exposing HOA abuse, we're ending it. This is the HOA Karen Files. And we don't just follow the rules, we weaponize them.